You could have written a book about Kennedy. You could have written a book about Oswald. What made you decide to invest your time in writing a book about Jack Ruby, a person who people often forget?
The very first inspiration was, like 12, 13 years ago. And I looked at the calendar and I said, oh, look, it's coming up on the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination. I wonder if anybody's doing a graphic novel because that's my background. And so I just started, and I was 10 years old when the assassination happened. So my memory and my understanding of it was a child's memory and understanding. Um, and and just in case some of your viewers don't know, Jack Ruby is the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused and presumed assassin of Kennedy, 2 days after the assassination
Uh,
on live television. That was the first time anybody had seen anybody kill anybody on live TV.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's a man with a gun.
So it was just completely weird and surreal and frightening. Um, so I started reading up on it, and I just kept being attracted to this figure, Jack Ruby. You know, I'll, I wrote a book called Disguised as Clark Kent: Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero. I'm from a deep Jewish background, and I will say that Ruby is not the proudest figure in American Jewish culture, but he's maybe one of the most idiosyncratic. He's from a classic sort of first generation American born immigrant family of Eastern European Jews, and a lot like my own family. And I just, sort of what kept the phrase or the kind of concept that kept coming to me was imagine your weirdest cousin shooting Lee Harvey Oswald on television. And the more I got in, and it just seemed to me, given my own interests and my own background, that this was the entry point. I soon figured out that I'm not smart enough to solve the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination. You know, um, I went down a lot of rabbit holes, and I just figured, all right, I'm not solving this. Let me try to paint a portrait of this really bizarre, interesting guy. And then I ended up. Um, just doing interviews with people who knew him in particular. And one thing I have in the book that I don't think anybody else has is I was in contact. You ever see a movie called Weekend at Bernie's? For your time, probably. You ever hear of it?
mm, yeah, no, I'm 21. I'm like still
Yeah.
2000s.
Well, it's a reference to. It's about. Weekend at Bernie's is a movie about. I don't even know if I've ever even seen it actually, but it's about a guy named Bernie who dies, but then his friends have to like literally prop up his body to pretend he's alive or some, it's a comedy.
That's doesn't seem funny at all.
Oh, but it's known for having that goofy plot. Well, the star of that was a guy named Jonathan Silverman. So again, some of your viewers may have heard of the movie or Jonathan. His father was Jack Ruby's rabbi, and he came to visit Ruby like every other day in prison because Ruby lived for more than 3 years, as opposed to Oswald, who died 2 days after the Kennedy assassination. Um, Ruby lived for 3 years, and he couldn't shut him up. When I interviewed the rabbi who died just like a little under 2 years ago at age 99, I interviewed him about 10 years ago, maybe 10 or 12 years ago. He offered me access to the notes he took when he visited Ruby in prison. And he said, do you want to see my notes when I visited Jack every other day for 4 months? And I said, yeah, I wouldn't mind. So, so I think I had some unique resources like that. I spoke to Ruby's niece and nephew, but Ruby had no children and he wasn't married, but I spoke to his niece and nephew. So and people like that, other people who'd been in the nightclub business, the children of other people who've been in the nightclub business in Dallas. So I tried to come up with a unique perspective um, on the assassination and on Ruby because there are really people who literally have spent the past 60 years studying the Kennedy assassination. I mean, and I can't compete with that. I can use their research, what they've published or made available. Um, but it did, sort of as we were discussing before, about I have a book called Superman on the Couch, what superheroes really tell us about ourselves and our society. Nobody had really written a psychological study of superheroes for, since the 50s. So with this, there have been books about Jack Ruby, but I don't think there's been a new one for decades. Um, Although another one came out right before mine, and my heart sort of sank. And it's a very good book, but it's about it's called Kennedy's Avenger. Um, but it's really mostly about the trial, which was a fascinating trial. It was one of the most more famous, what you call a circus trial. Sort of everybody in the courtroom was writing a book, including the judge. It was just sort of one outlandish thing after another. So that book, which I ended up using for reference, focused on the trial, whereas I try to give a broader and deeper picture of his whole life and his psychology and the people who knew him.
Mhm. You just mentioned the Jewish background part. How
Yeah,
much do you think that like impacted his life decisions in any shape or form?
I think to a great deal. He was very Jewish identified. Um, so at one point, I thought that maybe he was trying to almost do public relations for the Jewish people, that that as the he would be the guy that he would be the Jew that killed the guy that killed the president and be a hero. And that actually happened. He got tons of fan mail. He was a celebrity, you know, when right after the assassination, right after he killed Oswald, um, he was getting fan mail and he was being lauded as a hero, that, he did what the justice system wouldn't do or whatever. Although Oswald only been under arrest for 2 days, but so it's not like there was any kind of delay. Um, but what was going on in Dallas at the time? Dallas was a very interesting city, and it was sort of partly a northern progressive city and partly a southern racist city. It had elements of both, and then racism included anti-Semitism, and so there was a lot of, especially in the days leading up to Kennedy. It was a big thing that Kennedy was coming to visit Dallas. He was already campaigning for the 1964 reelection bid. Um, and Texas, there was a lot of dissension among the Democrats in Texas, different factions of the Democratic Party, which Kennedy was a member of. And among all the turmoil, um, and I don't want to go too deep into the weeds because, especially if people don't even, only have a basic surface understanding. But there was a fair amount of overt anti-Semitism, although there was an established and pretty prominent Jewish community. But there was an ad in the Dallas papers the days leading up that condemned Kennedy, and it was signed by someone named Bernard Weissman, which is not necessarily a Jewish name, but in America it often is. And Ruby, who was paranoid and high strung and uh, very anxious, thought that that name was put there in order that if anything bad did happen when Kennedy came, that it would be blamed on Jews. That was Ruby's thought. Well, I sort of should add a footnote here, or an overall. Obviously, there's a million conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination, and involving Ruby as well as Oswald. both of those guys were crazy. They had personal and family backgrounds of insanity. So the question is not were they crazy? The question is always were they lone nuts? Were they
Mm.
acting on their own or were they part of some bigger plan? But as I'm describing Jack Ruby's thought process and behavior, I realize it sounds irrational and crazy. But that is because he was irrational and crazy, and he had a large history of violence too. Although excuse me, he'd never been um, accused or indicted for murder, but he was well known for beating people up, especially if they said anything anti-Jewish. He would just come home just from going out for a night, at a nightclub or from a dinner out, and come home covered with blood because he'd gotten in a fight with somebody who was making anti-Jewish comments or even implied them, or he spent part of his career as a what they call a leg breaker or a strong arm man for a union in Chicago and probably for the Chicago mob. So he was a violent guy with a quick temper. Um, sort of in that tradition of of mobsters, of urban mobsters. You know, he um, he grew up in Chicago. He didn't come to Dallas till he was probably close to 40. He was in his late 30s when he came to Chicago. He had a lot of different jobs, um, and in the lead up to World War II, he was famous for beating up Nazis. He and his pals, including a boxer named Barney Ross, who was when boxing was a very Jewish sport. Ross was the lightweight or middleweight champion, and he was a childhood friend of Ruby's. Supposedly, the two of them worked for Al Capone doing errands, if you know that name.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, and so Ruby, he put his skills and his predilection for violence to better uses, beating up Nazis around Chicago in the 30s. But so he came to Dallas, ostensibly to help out his sister who was running a nightclub that was having trouble, but probably as some kind of incursion of the Dallas mob into Chicago, I'm sorry, the Chicago mob into Dallas.
Because besides that, he was also owner of a nightclub, right? Of multiple.
He owned multiple nightclubs. Of course, the most famous one was the Carousel, which was a strip club,
Yeah.
um, kind of one more of a burlesque kind of thing than what we think of as strip clubs now. But and there would be comedians and singers and musicians as well as the strippers. But he also owned a country western club, and Jack Ruby was the last person. I don't know if you ever heard of a guy named Hank Williams. Does that name ring a bell?
No, it doesn't ring a bell.
Hank Williams was, sort of one of the founders of what we think of as country music now,
Okay.
but very poetic. He was very tragic figure. He died in his 20s, I think, in 1953. But w- you know, was one of the people who really popularized country music. Beyond, say, just the American Southeast, and wrote a lot of famous country western songs. So Jack Ruby ran this club where when Hank Williams was becoming increasingly dependable because of illness and alcohol abuse and whatever, Ruby was one of the last people to offer the guy work. So yeah, he was in the nightclub business. He owned a movie theater. He actually was one of the first people to present integrated um, shows in Dallas, which was in many ways part of the South, and literally was in the South, but it was South, it was Southwest, or it wasn't part of the traditional American South. So Ruby actually, you know, broke some integration barriers by having black and white performers in another country venue. Was called Bob Will's um, Roadhouse, and now it's called the Longhorn Ballroom. It's still, I think, it's recently been revived in Dallas. So he was a very interesting, crazy character. He had contacts in both the high and low places of Dallas, both with the doctors and lawyers and rabbis, and also with the mobsters and lowlifes and strippers. And um, he made it hit because he owned these clubs and needed people to come to them. He made it his business to become well known and, if not liked, at least tolerated by um, newspaper reporters who wrote about show business and disc jockeys at radio stations, and by the police, who he had to be on good terms with so they wouldn't shut down his club. So he was a very well known, and as I say, a lot of people didn't like him, but they certainly knew him. So that again, that was part of the fascination with him from it.
Yeah, because that's what I'm like trying to understand. Because on the one part, what you explained in the beginning is that he was quite an aggressive person, like he could show violence.
Right.
But then the second thing, what you were just mentioning, sounds quite strategic, as in like he's a good people's person. He can build businesses. He can run businesses. Like it doesn't seem like the type of lone figure crazy guy
I
from
don't
that
know.
perspective.
I don't think any of his businesses were ever that successful.
Uh,
I mean, again, this is hard to document and or impossible to document, but he would start these businesses. He would have partners who were mobbed up people, I mean, look, the mob is not, you know, organized crime does not issue membership cards. So it's very hard to say, represent any of this stuff. But it does seem that these businesses would change hands back and forth between the same people, including Ruby. So I mean, I think it's likely that they were. He was not wealthy. He lived a really, pretty modest lifestyle, and sometimes even had to take in roommates to help pay the rent.
okay.
So I think he had these businesses. They were probably, to one degree or another, money laundering vehicles for organized crime. Um, but you're right, and let's not, and don't forget that one way or he had different sides, and he was not, he had street smarts, but I don't, he was not especially intelligent. Most people thought he was kind of an idiot, but he, you know, he did, whether he had inside help or not, he's still the guy who walked up in the middle of a room full of reporters and police and killed Oswald. I mean, you know, whoever he may or may not have had helping him, personally, I don't think he did, but I don't rule out the possibility. But especially if he didn't have help, you know, so he was certainly strategic enough, and there are times when you can see him. He had both sides, and I think that was part of his madness, was that he was capable. That there's an incident that I recount in the book that I read about in a memoir by a senator named Arlen Specter, who was on the Warren Commission, or was one of the lawyers on the Warren Commission, and when Ruby is giving testimony, he sort of takes control of the room. He sort of, after he's been convicted, and ultimately his conviction was overturned because there were a lot of irregularities in the case, and then he did die before he could be retried. Um, but sort of see that Ruby is sort of in control. So I think he was capable. of taking control and capable of focused violence, but there were a lot of times he would just sort of fall apart. And there was and his history is his parents were immigrants, and both alcoholics, and his father was very violent, and his mother was just a complete wreck. She spent a lot of her life trying to get rid of an imaginary fishbone in her throat that she thought she had. She literally had surgery for a non-existent ailment, and still. So I mean, it has that
That's
crazy.
a weird example to have in your childhood, someone like that.
Well, I'm sure that's not the. I mean, that's sort of the most famous or most colorful thing, but I think they were. I think both his parents were violent, and probably violent with their. He was one of eight children, and one of his siblings had died in a horrible scalding kitchen accident as an infant. So there's this whole traumatic history, and the family was constantly. But by the same token, he was very enmeshed with his family. That he was in business with his sister, even though he was violent with her, and they constantly were quarreling. But they had made up by the time of the assassination. And I don't think violent in the sense, I don't think he beat her up, because she was pretty tough. If you, if you ever look at video, of her, she's not she's not somebody who would, she would. I bet she would give back as good as she got, but they like had an argument about something, and and they were in a car, and he like pushed her out of the car. I think as it was moving. But but the funny thing is, his siblings all got together and pooled their resources when he killed Oswald. When he killed Oswald, they um, organized as a team, and because and then and they, you know, they hired and fired lawyers like there was no tomorrow. They just and they ended up with a probably the most famous lawyer in America at the time, a guy named Melvin Belli,
Mhm.
um, who was mostly a consumer rights advocate in San Francisco. Um, but I think through a high school connection of Ruby's brother, that's why it becomes because that again, that's part of the fascination to me. If I figured out soon enough that I wasn't solving the mysteries, then I looked at it really as a family story, and just his youngest brother Earl had become very successful as a dry cleaner in Detroit, Michigan. And he was the only, he was really the only one of the siblings who had any amount of money, whether you go out and hire a famous lawyer. Although Belli claimed that he would not take any money, and that he was doing it just to prove a case. So for and there's of course controversy about whether or not that's true, because the family claimed they paid Belli quite a bit of money, but who knows? I mean, Belli
Mm.
might have rationalized it as for expenses or something.
Yeah,
But
because what you
Belli,
did, sorry, yeah.
you know,
Yeah, what you did say in like a different podcast was that he had like a whole queue of like lawyers just waiting to like help him, as if you are the person who can basically uh help someone like Jack Ruby who killed someone on live television, then that's a great client review.
exactly. So there were, and plus, I think a lot of lawyers had sort of been they were primed already because they was thinking in a similar manner about Oswald. If you could at the very least save him from execution, then yes, it would be a great promotional, or not even promotional, just a great. I mean, that's like the ultimate challenge for a lawyer, right? So yeah,
Exactly.
so there were a lot of lawyers, um, but the family, I think, was so difficult to deal with that some of those lawyers backed out, or they were just too expensive. Belli really saw it as a challenge. Excuse me. And Belli saw it as a challenge, and there was a little bit of a personal connection. It ties into Frank Sinatra because,
He even plays,
well,
or like, what role does he play in this story? That's such a random name. A throw
uh,
in.
Sinatra um, was friends with Kennedy, although then they had a big falling out.
Uh,
Um, so there was Earl Ruby, the kid brother, the dry cleaner in Detroit, went to high school with a record executive from Reprise Records. Guy was probably mobbed up too. But Reprise Records was Frank Sinatra's label. So I think through that guy, I think there were a number of connections, but through that guy, Belli, that was one of their main connections to this Melvin Belli. And the other Sinatra connection is, although Sinatra and Kennedy had a famous falling out after being good friends, shortly after the assassination, Frank Sinatra Jr. was kidnapped.
oh, by who? Jack Ruby's nephew or
Well,
someone
that's
completely
interesting.
different?
Well, at first, there were some who thought that it was a warning to Kennedy to keep his nose out of the. I'm sorry, a warning to Sinatra to keep his nose out of the Kennedy assassination. Not to ruffle any feathers, not to hire private just keep your nose out of it, Frank.
Uh-huh.
Turned out it was a story that was both crazier and more prosaic, but it turned out it was a schoolmate of Sinatra Jr.'s who had gambling debts. That's another weird story. It ends up connecting to Jan and Dean, the rock stars of the. But that's a digression. But yeah, Sinatra fits in the story, because of his connection to Kennedy and because of the coincidence and the timing of the kidnapping of his son.
Mm. Do we know anything about like, has Frank Sinatra ever like openly said anything about the assassination or?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I'm sure I don't know because they had a really bad falling out. There was one point where Kennedy, there's even movies and books written about this. Kennedy was coming to Palm Springs where Sinatra lived, and Sinatra assumed he would stay at his house. But at the time, I think there was starting to be publicity about Sinatra's mob connections,
Mhm.
and so not only did Kennedy not stay at Sinatra's house, and Sinatra made all sorts of preparations and built all sorts of new guest rooms and stuff, but he stayed with Bing Crosby, who was Sinatra's, singing rival. um, yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know if Sinatra ever made any public statement. I'll have to look that up. That's
Mm.
a great question.
Let's like try to like I know it's very difficult, but let's try to understand like the assassination day. Um, you mentioned that he also brought his dog with him, right,
Right.
to the assassination.
Well, no, 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 no. You're mixing up a couple of different.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
he brought his dog with him the day he killed Oswald.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
What does to me that implies like a little like I'm gonna get away with it.
Oh, that's funny. That's very funny you say that. I think the more common interpretation, which makes sense, is that Ruby was home. The whole obviously the whole country was in turmoil after Kennedy's assassination, but especially Dallas. You can imagine,
Uh-huh.
if they had one job, keeping Kennedy safe while he was in town. The police and the government there and the mayor. And so Kennedy's dead. Everybody's freaking out. Ruby seems to have taken it upon himself to solve the murder, to solve the case. partly because of that Weissman signed ad, that thing that he thought was an attempt to frame the Jews. And so this is what argues against Ruby being part of a conspiracy, because you would he was not a professional hitman. He had never killed. He had never been accused. I think he might have been once arrested as a suspect, but never indicted, certainly never convicted. And there's no real record of him actually killing any. Very violent guy, beating up people, breaking legs, and whatever. So Ruby runs around Dallas, making himself as conspicuous as possible. And you would think if a guy whose job was to kill somebody, he'd try to be subtle. Now, it's quite possible that whether it was his own idea or whether he was employed by somebody, it seems that on Friday, the assassination happened on a Friday, and they captured Oswald at a movie theater shortly after that. And they had him in a locked room, and they were questioning him at Dallas Police Headquarters. And it does seem Ruby was trying to get into that room. Now, was it to kill Oswald? Maybe. Was it just because Jack Ruby was a nosy body who liked to be? He was like a spotlight hound who liked to be in the middle of everything and know everything. That's also possible. He himself said different things at different times about why he was there, but the room was locked and they wouldn't let him in. And then the rest of the weekend, he is running all over Dallas, being very conspicuous, as if he was hired as a private investigator to solve the mystery of the Kennedy assassination. He's at the post office looking at the post office box associated with that Weissman ad. He's like at a spontaneous memorial that people made to Kennedy. He's at 20 different restaurants and bars talking to. He's at police headquarters, helping out of town reporters meet local people to talk to, including Henry Wade, the district attorney, who is most famous as in Roe v. Wade. It's that same guy,
Okay.
So he is as conspicuous as possible. And he's sort of in his glory as Jack Ruby, the guy who knows everybody, the insider, which is, again, certainly not what you'd expect of somebody who was planning to assassinate somebody 2 days later. So Ruby has this manic weekend fueled by, no doubt, by these amphetamines he was taking to lose weight. That was very popular back then, was giving people speed so they'd lose their appetites. Sort of very primitive Ozempic.
Yeah.
So Ruby that morning gets up and he says to his roommate, something. I forget the exact words, but he almost says, "I'm going to go kill Oswald," which is crazy, and his roommate just thinks, well, that's just Jack saying like crazy stuff,
Uh-huh.
and he takes his door. But what he's going, Ruby gets a call. He owed some money to one of his dancers, and she really needed the money. And even though she didn't live that far away, he was going to wire it. It's a primitive form of PayPal or Zelle. Is you'd go to Western Union, the telegram place, and they could also wire money. So you give the clerk,
Like
25.
a middleman.
Yeah, the middleman, and then there'd be a clerk in another city. You give the person the $25.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really funny. I have to explain wiring money, but I figure I should. So Ruby, so he didn't like his dancers coming to his house because they very often had violent boyfriends. He didn't want them to rob him or try to get in a fight with him. So he goes down to downtown Dallas to the Western Union office. He lived a short drive away. And he waits online patiently. And he brought his dog with him, his favorite dog. Ruby he had trouble with human relationships, but he was very, really close to his dog, but very close. He had a lot of dogs, and his dogs wrecked his house. They wrecked his car. I mean, they were not very disciplined. but he brought his favorite dog, a dachshund named Sheba, as in the Queen of Sheba, with him. And he left her in the car while he went into the Western Union office. And then it took him, maybe 15 minutes waiting online. He wires the money, and then he sees the commotion going on at the police station as they're transferring Oswald. And so his story, and sort of the Warren Commission story, is that he gets, because he likes to be where the excitement is, he goes over there to see what's going on. And he had his gun with him because he often carried a gun because he often had a lot of cash from his nightclubs. Um, and then supposedly he was just seized by this spontaneous um, rage and anger and mania, and somehow got in there to kill and step through this crowd of reporters and police and killed Oswald. Right? There are other theories, of course, that he was hired, that the police made way for him, um, that he was part of a conspiracy. It does seem, I mean, again, by all accounts, when he was at Western Union sending that wire, um, it doesn't seem that he was in any kind of a hurry. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't looking at his watch. He took his time he made small talk with the clerk. So again, does not seem like a guy who had a ordained appointment or was being led. Because that's the other question that people ask is how did he get in to such a heavily guarded facility when they were transferring Oswald? And it seems like one of the police guarding the door was distracted by somebody else. But again, I think even if they saw him, Jack Ruby was such a part of the Dallas downtown scene and such a guy who wanted to be where the action was and know what was going on. I don't think and was very friendly with the cops. So I don't think anybody would have stopped him even if they saw him. They would have just said, "Oh, it's Jack being Jack." There was so that seems to me to be probably what happened, but I can't rule out that there's there's perfectly rational people who put those same clues together and say, the police were alerting him and keeping him appraised of Oswald's movements, and it was all set up. It seems unlikely, but certainly by no means impossible.
So he himself, he is the one who, but what you mentioned before, he has changed up his stories a couple times. But
Oh, I'm sorry about the yeah, about the dog. I want to go back to the dog though. So he left the dog in the car,
yeah,
and a lot of people think, because he loved his dog so much, he wouldn't have taken the dog and left her in the car if he had gone downtown with the express mission of killing Oswald.
mm-hmm. Well, the thing what I had in mind was, I'm not a detective, but what I was thinking is often you're not supposed to keep your dog in the car as it's
Right.
dangerous, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking, like, if he's leaving his dog in the car, that must mean that he has the idea of like coming back to the car.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah,
Yeah.
after the killing, you're thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the more common presumption is that he thought he'd come back to the dog right after he wired the money. I mean, that would be an incredible level of arrogance and hubris to think to have this murder plan and leave your dog in the car. But again, I wouldn't put it past a guy that crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who made that same conclusion as you.
Because he has said himself that he was really only planning to wire the money. Like it was just a 1 second thought, like spontaneous thing. He was like, "Oh, I've got the gun with me. Rage is coming. I'm gonna kill him."
But
That's the story that he keeps on backing up.
yeah, but occasionally, among his many stories, he also implies that that he was going downtown to kill Oswald also. As I said, he was not consistent. If you can imagine, Oswald, uh, while you would think the Dallas police and the court people would have been more careful, right? Kennedy was killed and Oswald was killed. And you would think that they would have been more stringent about protecting Ruby or keeping him from being a target by any. Because if your theory is that, right, that if Ruby was sent as a cleanup man to make sure that Oswald didn't talk, then you would think it would be logical that somebody would come in to take out Ruby, or somebody might just, want to, the, the son, or somebody would just want revenge on Ruby for killing, for silencing us, whatever it was. He would think he'd be better protected.
Yeah, you think like you'd clean up the cleanup man.
Yeah, or just have
Yeah.
revenge on the cleanup man or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a very soft. They did keep him in solitary, you know, confinement. They didn't. They kept him out of the general prison population in the Dallas County jail. Um, but really, he had many visitors. People were constantly coming and going. And in the courtroom, although Ruby was not allowed to testify on his own behalf, he was the ultimate soft target. He would have impromptu news conferences at every recess, and reporters would just, you see pictures. There's dozens of, hundreds of, not about hundreds, but dozens of reporters crowding in on him. Would have been very easy for somebody to sneak in, pretending to be a reporter and kill him. But he went, like I said, 3 years, and until he eventually died of a combination of like cancer, heart disease, pneumonia, which for some reason that either willfully or just out of neglect, none of his jailers or visitors, his family noticed. His sister was very concerned about his health. But both he and Oswald died innocent in the eyes of the law. Ruby's conviction was overturned because they had his trial in Dallas, and how could you have, everybody in Dallas was so hell bent on convicting him. Question wasn't whether he killed Oswald. Obviously, he killed Oswald.
Because
It was his state of mind. Was he legally insane?
Yeah, exactly. Because there was a psychologist, right, that visited him or wanted to visit him in prison.
There were endless psychologists. There was, and again, there was one who was famed, who later became, or actually previous, had been involved with CIA experiments with LSD and other mind-altering things. And I haven't looked at the research. I think it was previous to that he became involved with this MK Ultra, it was called, and so that, of course, leads a lot of people to think there was some type of conspiracy going on. Although that guy, after he examined Oswald, after he examined Ruby, he basically said, "This guy is out of his mind." Institutionalize him. Don't. There were a lot of psychiatrists who would, the Belli, the lawyer, Melvin Belli, was trying to prove the case based on this very esoteric psychological premise called psychomotor epilepsy that was very tricky to prove, but he thought he would at least get Ruby spared from the electric chair, about that. But Ruby was convicted. But then again, because Dallas everybody was so shaken in Dallas that ultimately the case was overturned by a law team led by a guy named William Kunstler, who was most famous as the lawyer for the Chicago 7 or the Chicago 8 later in the 60s. He himself was also a very famous lawyer and would become more so. Kunstler, for his part, did not think Ruby was part of any conspiracy. He thought he was too crazy and not smart enough to be part of, that nobody, you know, the most plausible theory that I hear or that I've read is that maybe there were 10 people assigned to kill Oswald, in Dallas. And Ruby happened to be, quote unquote, lucky enough to be the guy who got close to the best opportunity. So that, you know, that really doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard to fly an actual professional hitman into Dallas within a couple of hours. And that is one theory that Ruby was sort of reluctant, and that because Ruby did, after he was arrested, he grew progressively crazier in prison
Okay.
and was having all sorts of delusions. He thought he had started he claimed he thought he started the second Holocaust in America. Um, but there are those who think that might have come from the fact that maybe somebody threatened his family, and so he, that might have been what led him to be willing to be recruited as one of the 10 possible. Most of these theories don't really hold up, but they don't seem, fully impossible either. That's why, but no one's ever proved, to my knowledge and to my satisfaction, none of these none of these theories have been proved. Doesn't mean they're possible, but it does seem like he was most likely a lone nut.
Because didn't Trump recently like sign something to release the JFK files?
Yes, Trump. Well, he ordered that the last remaining JFK files be released, which they have not yet been. Uh,
Oh, okay.
I find it hard to imagine that if such files existed, that they were not, if documents proving a specific conspiracy existed, that they would not have been destroyed long ago.
Exactly.
I think over the years, there have been every few years, there was a law passed in the 90s that all this stuff had to be released like right around the past few years. So I think there's been more detail released. I think there's more about the CIA monitoring Oswald, which a lot of people think indicates that they were behind the assassination. Um, there are details like more about, Jack's brother's tax return. So, we know how much money he spent on Jack's defense and stuff um, but I can't imagine that there's anything, that would, be so to speak, a smoking gun for any theory, but we'll see.
And to get back to Jack Ruby, so what I'm curious about, like in those 3 years, was he defensive? Was he admitting? Was he like, what type of figure was he? Like, how was he handling all those court cases, and what type of person was he during court?
He was all over the map. Sitting in court, he would, and descriptions of people visiting him, in court, or people visiting him in prison, specifically the rabbi, but other people visited him. He would sometimes act as if he had just been arrested for like a parking violation. He would sometimes be like cowering in a corner or under a table. He exhibited sometimes he'd feel very confident, sometimes he'd feel very badly. He'd regret what he said. He felt that he had brought shame to the Jews, as opposed to his original theory that he would do something to make Jews proud of him. He was all over the map. He was, he was crazy. I mean, unless he was the world's greatest actor, unless he was able to like put on these different personalities for different people at different times. Like I said, he had a history of mental illness. He had at least one nervous breakdown where he'd come close to suicide. in the 50s. He look. I think one of the reasons that he owned, or at least was a front in these nightclubs was he couldn't actually hold a job. He was he would just get into so very violent and aggressive, but the flip side of that was very timid and passive and frightened. And like I said, unless he was the world's greatest actor, he just had these multiple weird personalities. But when he did, there's a certain strategic aspect to how his family and his lawyers handled his case too, because after he was convicted, it was only then he agreed to talk to the Warren Commission. And if people people like to cherry pick things he said to imply that he knew that Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, that Johnson was responsible. You know, you can pick and choose things that that Ruby said in his Warren Commission testimony and other interviews to support almost anything, but it does seem he insisted he couldn't tell the truth unless he was taken to Washington and got to speak directly to President Johnson. Um, it's very weird, but there are moments in that testimony when he literally he took charge of the room and was ordering Earl Warren and the other members around, like in the book I put it, like they were busboys at the Carousel Club. It's very it, you know he was different things to different people, and while he could be very violent and very calculating, there's also endless stories of him being generous and nice to people and just giving people money and using his influence on people, whatever influence he had on people's behalf. So he was very inconsistent, which is again what makes him an interesting character to write about and read about.
Yeah. And did anyone entertain the idea of him? Like, because now a lot of people entertain the idea of him being in some type of conspiracy. But like back in the day when he was alive, was there any attention on him in that sense of
Yeah,
people thinking?
I think the minute Kennedy was shot, there were conspiracy theories. I mean, and if you look at it, the narrative of Kennedy being shot and Oswald being arrested seems very flimsy. There, of all the people in Dallas that day to pick out Oswald, by the same token, Oswald's behavior is very incriminating.
Hmm.
Oswald gets away, but then himself goes home, gets a gun, gets on a bus, then kills a guy, kills a cop, um, hides in a movie theater. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't add up in the so from the very beginning, and then of course people were having conspiracy theories, and then certainly 2 days later when Oswald was shot by Ruby, yeah, they started immediately, and I mean, and then obviously they've not stopped. Um, it's interesting. There's a woman named Dorothy Kilgallen who was a famous reporter of the era, and um, and she claimed to have gotten. She was, if you ask your maybe your grandparents, there was or especially if or if you know any Americans of the older Americans, she was most famous as being a panelist on an ongoing quiz show called What's My Line. But she was a celebrity reporter, and
Hmm.
she claimed to have gotten an exclusive interview with Ruby, where he told her everything. But then she died like 2 or 3 years later under quote unquote mysterious circumstances, never having revealed that interview to anybody. And now there's a big movie coming out with Al Pacino and some other famous stars, and I think directed, I think Barry Levinson, but a very prominent. So suddenly the Dorothy Kilgallen, you know, there were a lot of people who died in the wake of the Kennedy and Oswald murders who it could be argued died mysteriously or violently. I don't know. I mean, a lot of them were kind of marginal people who lived violent lifestyles or marginal lifestyles.
Hmm.
Again, there doesn't seem If somebody dies violently 2 or 3 years later, it's hard to me anyway, it's hard to say that's part of some kind of cover up. But, and Kilgallen claimed she was saving this Ruby interview for a bigger book and a bigger expose. Um, so we'll see what this movie does. There's a lot, there's a lot of weird stuff surrounding the cases. But I'm not smart enough to figure it out. As I said, that's why I just thought Ruby, weird Jewish guy, not that different from a lot of my relatives.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if any of my relatives are that violent, but just in terms of the background and the mindset.
Because that interview has never been published till this day.
Supposedly it disappeared. I mean, when my research, it indicates she had maybe 5 minutes with him. And although I think he was a fan of hers because she was a well-known reporter and was on that quiz show, I don't know what he would have said in those 5 minutes alone with her. Unless he explicitly said, I was hired by this guy, and here's the check stub, or what. It it does seem unlikely that in that 5 minutes she had with him, he would have trusted her enough to spill the beans on the
Yeah.
whole thing.
Because did he ever, as in like his final words or final moments, say anything?
Yes, his final moments. He was dying. He was in a hospital in Dallas, same hospital that Oswald and Kennedy died in Parkland Hospital. He was on his deathbed, and his brother and sister snuck a tape recorder in because in those days tape recorders were big. So they had to sneak a tape recorder in a suitcase, and then have another sibling distract the guard. And Jack basically, said there was no conspiracy. I did it on my own. It was all my idea. So that's the closest we had, and that's on tape. That's been released publicly long ago. A guy named Lawrence Schiller, who was sort of a famous photographer and reporter who's still alive, was there helping the family record it. So that's Ruby's last word. Now, if he was feeling that his family had been threatened by whoever had hired him, then maybe he would have maintained that story until the end. But you know, that was literally, well, not literally. I mean, he didn't die that day, but he died a few days later. That's the last thing we have on record of Ruby saying no conspiracy, it was all me alone.
And did any of his family members die in some mysterious way?
Nope.
Or
Nope. And
no?
You would have thought that they would that if he'd been part of a plot, that people would have assumed he probably would have told one of his siblings. No, none of them were
Exactly.
bothered by. They were bothered by like people who were just angry about the whole situation, but no, they never had. As far as aside from having their reputations ruined, I mean, his nephew, it was 12 at the time, um, lived in Dallas. And he used to brag that his uncle owned a strip club because he was 12 years old and his uncle owned a strip club.
He's a cool kid.
Yeah. So imagine having to go back to school like 2 days later and your name is Ruby and, and your crazy uncle just killed Oswald. So people did, try to beat him up and he had a teacher who had to protect. I mean, for the family members who had shared that last name, especially the ones in Dallas, it was not a picnic. There was, I think, his niece. She wasn't in Dallas. She was in Detroit area. But even her classmates would call her Killer Ruby. That was,
Wow.
she ended up becoming a criminal. She ended up studying criminal psychology.
That's fascinating. But like, wasn't public opinion, because that's what I would think, like public opinion was mostly supportive because he killed the man who killed the president.
At first, it was, and as I said, he got a lot of fan mail. But at a certain point, people then realized, oh, because of this guy, we'll never know the real story. Because he killed Oswald before Oswald could talk, we will, so he came to be, not only did they, but in some weird sort of mass psychological transformation, people almost started blaming him for Kennedy's assassination. He
Maybe
started.
because they thought that he was working with the CIA, so it's a part of the problem, I
No, I
guess.
don't think it was even that rational. I think it was just sort of in the public consciousness. It's hard. I mean, I was a kid then, so I don't remember it. But from what I've read, it just so, and from, it just seems like somehow people in their minds, I don't think it was anything as rational as, oh, it must have been a conspiracy of blah, blah, blah. It was just somehow in people's minds, he became the killer of Kennedy.
Mm.
And
And while writing this book,
right.
to like wrap it up, what was like the one thing that surprised you the most while doing your research about Jack Ruby? Like, what's one of the things that you didn't expect to find about? It could be his personality, his psychology,
Yeah.
his.
I guess I didn't know how embedded he was in the show business world of Dallas. Kind of, oh, the guy owns a strip club, sort of it's a little salacious and sexy and whatever, but I think I didn't realize how much a part of this community at various communities in Dallas he was, that he wasn't, that he was the exact opposite of some, like, you know, hired hitman arriving in the middle of the night. He was, whether people loved him or hated him, he was very much a part of multiple communities in Dallas. I think that was probably the most surprising thing.
Okay. Well, fascinating character. Thank you for sharing his story for the past hour.
Oh
If
well,
anyone's interested, your book will be in the description.
well,
Definitely recommend it.
I appreciate your interest, and if you have any follow up questions, send me an email or something.